when you are dealing in a new organization, when you started a new university or a new industrial research lab, one of the major bones of contention can often be over mixed models of what success are. So you may have a vision, hopefully you have a vision in your mind of what you want to do next, what you want to be successful. That could be publishing more papers, it could be getting more grants in an industry, it could be getting a promotion, it could be having impact in the field, it could be making lots of money. Realize that your colleagues may not have exactly the same model of success. And is what you are trying to do helping them become successful, neutral to their success, or inhibiting their mode of success? So you may find that some of the arguments, some of the challenges come because you're assuming everybody has the same model of success, or you may not know your model of success, and you may even be a little chaotic in how you're interacting with your colleagues. So coming from the industry side, I have a view that there are maybe more different options of being successful in industrial research, because you can be very academic, you can be very product oriented, you can be very professional society, you can be many, many different, and that actually adds to the confusion because there's these mixed modes. So first is understand what you think success is, understand what your colleagues are, and if you're at loggerheads, maybe you need to adjust to help them or help them understand how to adjust to help you. The second is second point I want to make is about communicating value. As Farnham said in his talk, we love the technology. That's why we're in this field. Not everybody you communicate with has the same appreciation for your underlying technology or theory or algorithms or whatever it is that you do. It is incumbent on you to communicate why somebody should bother to listen to you and understand and want to spend time on you. So the usual joke is the person comes up to give a talk and says, world hunger is an increasing problem, let G be a graph. That's not enough. It's one of the hardest things that I see as young PhDs in industrial research in their first time trying to talk to a business executive is to try to get past that first slide in their PowerPoint deck. Why should you listen to what I'm going to tell you? That means you need to understand what's important to them to some degree, what problems they have, what problems you think you can help them solve, and then they'll start paying attention and interacting. If you're lucky, the people you're listening to also have a love of technology, and your enthusiasm can make it through, but often you'll just get stuck. You'll get this blank stare. You're presenting them the best idea in the world, and they just have no clue. You actually have to put yourself in their shoes and tell them, and it's incumbent on you. So if you're being ignored, you're probably not communicating the value in the language of the person listening. And I guess the third point I make, and this is probably very much more on the industry side than on the academic side, is there are times when you are trying to solve a problem in the workplace, and we've all been trained to be self-sufficient. Most of our advisors couldn't care less if we were having a problem, unless it was getting in the way of their grant. So you had to solve your own problems. That's true in the real world, but not always true. So there are times when I see young researchers wasting a huge amount of time fighting a piece of the bureaucracy, where going up and talking to their manager or their second line manager or whatever, and let the appropriate level to handle the escalation could dismiss the problem entirely, or actually be told, we've tried to fight that battle, we're not going to win that battle, don't waste your time on it. Again, most of my academic colleagues are much more independent. They don't have a hierarchy. The fact that there's a department chair doesn't mean that the department chair tells them what to do, as you all know that if you've been a department chair or a dean, or maybe a little bit more for a dean. But in industry, there is a hierarchy in most labs, and there is actually value in that. There's a lot of non-value in that, but there is value. They can help you solve problems that are the appropriate level. Not everything, you don't want to bump up everything, every problem you have, but learning the difference between things you need to solve as the technical expert and those things that your management is supposed to solve for you is a really important time saver and can get around a lot of the problems in the workplace.
When you start your professional career, you pick a community that you're going to be a part of. And you and I are extraordinarily privileged in this country that we are so well educated, we're independent. And so you, like me, say, I've chosen computer science, or something close to it, and I'm going to solve the problems there. And for now, I'm going to affiliate with, I started off at Carnegie Mellon, but I very quickly learned I was in the operating systems community, and I very quickly learned that my community was those people. And so SIGOPS became very important. That community was in general at that time for me. Over your professional career, you affiliate with different organizations, and if it's a place that hires you, you do need to get paid, but you can get a job many places, so you change. All our high-impact speakers, all of them talked about being multiple places. So you affiliate from time to time, and it may be an employer, but it may be something like a different kind of organization like a CCC, and that you're affiliated with that because it's a good platform. I was at CMU because it was a good platform. I'm now at the University of Virginia. For me, it's a good platform. But I choose to affiliate places to work in my community. For me, I have a couple of them. One is national security. So 2 days ago, I was in the Pentagon. That was my workplace, and I was doing some crazy problems on use of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is an important problem, which leads me to my second point. First point is your workplace is the community that you've chosen, and you're very rare that you have the independence to say that. You don't just work for an Amazon or an eBay or an IBM or a university. You work where you choose to work because you're working in the community. Why? Second point is choose important problems and solve them. Don't mess around with lesser problems, but pick something important. Our field is changing all of society, and so there are important problems everywhere. Third point is to work with the smartest and wisest people you can find. And several of you, you're just beginning your career, and you've told me that, well, I'm collaborating with so-and-so, who's at a different university or a different company. That's ideal. You picked out that person as a smart, wise person to work with. It's better to be with the first team than with a sandlot team. And so the people that are closest to you may not even be in your company. And typically there's not just in your department, there are a few people, but it's out in the community. So third point is pick smart, wise people and work with them on those important problems. The community you pick, the problems you pick, and the people you choose to work with define who you are. In politics, we were asked to talk about that. My philosophy, as I actually said in an earlier panel, is figure out what are the guiding principles, what's the right thing to do, and use that to guide what you do. I am not smart enough or have enough memory to figure out Anita's policy for managing this research group is XYZ. So I always go back to fundamental policies. So the subject came up yesterday on who should be the authors on the paper. And for me, it's whoever, it's the communication of an intellectual idea, so it's the people who contributed. Who wrote, who did the data research, who had the idea, whatever. And if you're heading that group and there's some friction over who should be first and second, if what you do is say, well, my principle is it's the people who did the work, and then you listen to everybody's argument of why they should be first, and then you pick something, the politics, they may not like what you decide, but the politics really goes away because you decided based on a principle that everybody can understand and can accept as it's a good thing. Now, if you want politics, I advise you to go into the government. it actually gets more politically difficult. So let me tell you one story. I was responsible in DoD for the Science and Technology program, and therefore I kept an eagle eye on where the budgets were going. You know, like Willie Sutton says, always follow the money. And the Air Force one year came in, and they were going to cut their science and technology budget, this is what they were proposing to the Secretary, by 30%. And that violated half a dozen of my fundamental principles. And so I had the wherewithal to raise this as an issue, the Air Force hated that, way up to the Secretary's level. Because for me, this was a resignation level issue. I mean, no service should cut science and technology by 30%. So when I went in to argue against this, I just argued the basic principles, not politics. And that was that if the Air Force did that, they would debase the last 5 years of their research because of the unstable continued funding. And what had been accomplished in the last 10 years would go down the tubes because all of a sudden researchers weren't funded. And you must keep stability for all the good reasons. You must fund research because that's where the Air Force gets new capability. Anyway, so fundamental argument after fundamental argument, and I persevered. And it was because I didn't mess around with politics and budget politics, especially when there's $750 million on the table, get nasty sometimes. But if you argue from first principles, you can often take the high road and win the political argument. And so I submit that that's some good advice for you. So in closing, let me give you a vignette. I think that the dramatic increase of postdocs in computer science is an important problem. So I decided I would invest some energy on it. And what am I affiliated with where I could do something like that? Well, doing something in my university would be pretty limited. And so I chose the venue, the affiliation, if you will, the workplace, if you will, as CCC. And so Erwin Gianchandani and I, let's see, I was a little bit involved in the CIFellows project, but after that ended, Erwin and I, or after that got firmly started, wrote a best practices document, which you can find out on the CRA website. And then after that, how do you make some progress? We got some NSF funding to fund 3 university consortiums to figure out how to implement best practices. And so my objective, again, I want to solve important problems. And an important problem is as we double and double and redouble the number of postdocs in CS, the computer science research community better figure out how to manage and support that very important new, now large constituency. There are 2 postdocs for every science and engineering professor at MIT. I mean, these numbers are growing large and in computer science. So what I'm hoping is that these 3 consortium will in fact figure out how to implement best practices and promulgate them across our whole community, particularly the academic community, but also industrial. And so I would ask you in closing to, when you see their reports in the next several years, and when the issues come up, interact with your organization that you're affiliated with, your university, your industry, and make sure that the community goes from being one postdoc, one advisor, who if that advisor doesn't do a good job, that postdoc is just hosed, to the organizations, the departments, the taking responsibility for making sure those postdocs were well supported, because that's what CCC is trying to cause to happen. So we enlist your help.
I think each of us interpreted this session a little bit differently, and so I interpreted it as kind of some ideas on how to work well, right, with our colleagues, and so that's kind of how I'll approach this. And I have a few slides. I guess I should say in the sort of spirit of good time management, I did these on an airplane a couple of days ago, so it doesn't make me an expert at this. It's just sort of my thoughts, and so I have 4 points I want to make, and I'll have 4 slides is all. And so the first point is actually about sort of you as a professional. And so I think we think about our careers in terms of sort of the papers we write, right? That's what shapes us as an intellectual. and the grants and projects we do and so forth. And what I'll propose, and I think this is very consistent with Anita's last point, is that part of what shapes you as a professional is how you interact with your colleagues. And so, and that's going to happen over a long period of time. So the interesting thing about being in academics is that, you're not going to be working with these people for a year or even 5 years. You'll probably be working with these people for the next 25 years. And so you're going to have 25 years to create an impression on them. And what I'll propose to you is that there's lots of little subtle things you do over time that create who you are as a professional. And here, what I focused on is kind of a notion of sort of, how should I say it, forthrightness and earning people's trust. And I think this is a key part of conflict, of dealing sort of with politics and conflict. And that is, as you go into situations, in the short term, it may be to your disadvantage to, let's say, lay all your cards on the table, right? So as you make a case for something, right, we have colleagues, we know this, who say, fine, this is what I want, and they put their facts down. And there's a lot of facts that they withhold from that conversation. And I would propose to you that in general, in the long term, it's going to benefit you to be forthright and honest with people and put all your cards on the table. And I think this is consistent also with what Anita was saying, that if you're going to make your case and make your point, it should be done from first principles rather than through some political mechanisms. And my experience is if you play the political angle of things, eventually it catches up with you. And slowly over time, people sort of view you as a political animal rather than as a good colleague who they can trust when it comes to conflict and helping to resolve things. And so that's basically the point I want to make on this. So the second thing is about attitudes. And so I guess this is sort of trite, that is to sort of be positive, right? And so I come from a generation where it was sort of not very cool to be very positive. I mean, I come from a generation where it's cool to be negative and cynical and so forth. So it's actually taking me probably a couple of decades. First of all, I'm a slow learner to figure out that it's that people actually work better with people who have positive, sort of constructive attitudes towards things. And I think it is fine around friends and at parties to be that cynical, kind of negative person. But at work, it really, I've noticed, makes a huge difference if you can sort of try to always take a positive view of things. I think you and everybody else benefits. And there's a corollary of this, which is particularly important for politics at work. And that is, oftentimes, I find political situations and conflicts come out of people assigning bad motives to other people. So in other words, someone says something to you, and you say, okay, well, the reason for that is they don't like me and so forth. So you get an email. It's rude. We've all gotten rude emails. And so, so you have to decide how you're going to interpret that. Was it because the person was busy and didn't have time to write a nice email, or is it because they're out to get you? And so you see this in faculty, these conspiracy theories developing and so forth. So I think, one thing is to come into each situation with a fairly positive outlook and try not to assign bad motives to otherwise innocuous behaviors. So if you read any book on workplace and conflict and politics and so forth, everyone's going to talk about communication. And of course, we know that's critical. Let me just propose to you a proposition. A lot of us spent our formidable years alone in front of computers, right? So that's why we're computer science. Many of us are computer scientists because we spent a lot of time alone with computers. And I'll propose to you that that doesn't lead to the best communication skills. So I think it's a safe assumption that we all can use a lot of work in this area. And I think one particular thing I want to make a point on, which is email. And so when it comes to conflict in politics, my experience, and I think most of you will admit, that email is absolutely deadly. And I can't tell you the number of conflicts and fights that have resulted in our department simply because people insist on sort of trying to win an argument through some email conversation. And so with my faculty, for instance, I'll solicit input on things. And if it's a controversial topic, I'll explicitly say to them, let's not have an email discussion on this. Send me your input, I'll summarize it, and we'll talk about it at a meeting. but let's not have a huge email debate on this because it just doesn't help. And as soon as, I would argue, as soon as you start into email and the responses you're getting back are not what you expected, it's probably not going to get resolved by email. So face-to-face meetings or phone calls are always preferable when it comes to any sort of delicate situation. And I think many of us overestimate our ability to communicate effectively by email. And so the final point I want to make is sort of facing realities. And so that is, despite all this positive sort of stuff that I'm proposing to you, there are some bad people out there. And I think we all sort of have worked with people who are in some sense incorrigible, right? So they're probably not going to come around to a kind of a positive, constructive way of thinking. There's very few of those people, I would propose to you. So if everybody you meet starts looking like Montgomery Burns, I would argue it's probably something with you, and you probably need to communicate better and assign better motives to people's behaviors. On the other hand, there are some bad people, and I think one of the things you can do is if you've earned sort of the trust of your colleagues, you can mitigate the damage those people can do to you and the organization that you're working in. Okay, so in other words, I think if you have a cohesive group of people that trust each other, those people tend to naturally fall to the edges and become less influential. And so the other point I want to make here is that there's a lot of stuff that you can't do at work. There's a lot of stuff that's going to be beyond your pay grade. And so all of us work in organizations that have sort of administrative structures to deal with very significant problems like harassment and discrimination and mental health and so forth. And so it is going to be important to recognize when something is out of your league and to rely on the support of your organization to help you do these things. And then the final point I want to make is that, unfortunately, with all due respect to the previous session, this stuff takes time. And it's when you get into some sort of administrative position, it's unbelievable how much time you spend dealing with these things, and I just don't think there's any way around it. I think that the only thing you could do is just accept that in order to do it right and in order to avoid conflict and make your way through sort of political organizations, you're going to have to take the time to do it, and it will eat into other things.
I wanted to pose a question to the panel, which is, what's the worst political situation you found yourself in, and how did you dig yourself out?
Wow.
Take a moment. Take a moment.
That's a terrible question.
It's hard.
The worst that I had was being a manager where there was a sexual harassment situation going on. And it's not only the way it destroys the cohesiveness of the team, but legally, organizational management has to get involved. And believe me, the first time you're in that, you assume you can handle it, and you can't. I ended up in the director of research office being lectured on how I mishandled the situation. And he was being constructive, but boy, talk about being scared. I mean, it's like going to the principal when you're in elementary school. You've got to learn to know when you're out of your depth, and maybe it's not a no coach, but you need to be able to have somebody to go to and say, what do I do now? So that was the worst one I remember.
Let me chime in and basically agree with Brent. If I think about the question as a personal experience, the toughest situation is when I thought I was being discriminated against. It happened very, very rarely. But you feel just trapped, and you're defensive, but you really can't lash out. And I think the same thing is true in terms of when I was responsible for other people, not just discrimination, but any time some person was individually being mistreated and I couldn't fix it. Those are really the worst situations. As I started, I think you and I every one of us is blessed with having been educated to be people who are capable of achieving a great deal, whatever we turn our minds to, and having a lot of leeway and not so many restrictions to do it. But when somebody puts a restriction on a person which is not fair and keeps them from being what they what they can be. That's just the worst situation in my view.
If there's some issue at hand that you're interested in, but there seems to be a heated discussion between more senior people in the department or in the organization, so it's not clear at what stage is it worth for us to try and express our opinions or to say anything on this. So I think I've probably erred on the side of probably saying too much, but I've always been, I think, honest and clear and said this is, what I think about it, and not tried to take specific sides on it. And it's people have always been, haven't dragged me into anything that's been more on the heated side of it. But I was wondering if you had any advice on that.
So I wouldn't mind commenting, as this is sort of near and dear to my heart. So I've worked at 2 different organizations, and the previous one, I won't say what it is, but now you'll know. You'll look at it. But it was a very different culture, and in fact, as a junior faculty member, I was even told explicitly, okay, this is kind of how junior faculty should behave at meetings. And it was a response to my speaking up and so forth. So there was a culture there, and it was done politely. I was told politely, you might want to be just sort of a little bit careful and so forth. Now, that was not ideal, and I'm no longer at that institution. But on the other hand, I do think it helps to know the organization and what the culture is and what the expectations are. And I think, if you're in a situation and, you want to sort of figure out what the ground rules are, and if you're not comfortable with them, you probably need to be patient and expect that someday you'll change those rules through your own example and leadership. But I think that to do that, you need to be there long enough to do that, which means you need to probably play by the rules long enough to get into a position of responsibility, or you need to move on to another organization. But I think the key is to know the organization. And I could say the organization you're at is very open to young faculty expressing their points of view.
I think it's very much a minority situation, but there are occasionally problems in universities where there is a set of people that have running friction, and they are having a battle over some one or even several kinds of topics. And especially as a junior faculty member, it's probably not the case that you can change the tide, and maybe it's not worth your spending your time on it because you can't. But if the issue is really one that's important in the culture of your community, I would go back to something I said earlier, and that is, if you argue from first principles, it is not you stating your opinion, it is you saying, well, we've got a situation here, and I think the basis on which we should make decisions is this principle. And you're really arguing or advocating about that principle, and it becomes less personal. And you don't become part of the fracas.
Yeah, so I'm going to speak out of both sides of my mouth here. There are venues where you're probably better off not saying something. So my advice is, if you get invited to a new context, do what Ross says. Try to find out what the culture is. I had to explain to one of my very senior people, asking a question in this particular venue is not an enhancement to anything. It's never going to solve a problem. On the other hand, most of our field, again, most of the field is not Montgomery Burns, as Ross said. Most times it's okay to express the opinion, even if you're not in a position of power. But one thing I learned, I was on a school board when I lived in New York, and we had communication training or something. But one thing I remember is they said, once you've made your point, don't repeat it. And we all have a tendency to say, if we only say it enough times or slowly enough or loudly enough, somehow we'll win. And yes, sometimes you really, you're in a discussion of trying to get an architecture designed or something, and you really have to make the point 2 or 3 times. But most times, you make the point, you throw it out there. If it falls like a lead balloon, just let it go. Maybe talk to somebody afterwards or whatever. That's really hard for us. I mean, we kind of all trained, well, we all grew up with flame wars and email and just repeating ourselves, cutting and pasting the argument. I mean, just try to avoid saying it again.
I think you just pick your problems, do a good job of solving them. Your papers will stand on their own. Your arguments will stand on their own. And eventually people will realize that you are not under the umbrella of your old advisor. I actually had a similar situation. I stayed as a faculty member at the university that I was trained at, which was Carnegie Mellon. You should never do that, you know, that's a terrible idea. And so my thesis advisor was this wonderful, a brilliant man, Nico Haberman. But I actually never had that feeling. I was, you know, Nico said she's independent, and so he never acted that way, and very soon I was an independent person. So just keep putting one foot in front of the other, do your work, and show that you are a star in your own right.
People have trouble sort of abstracting and disliking people if they know them very well, right? And so it sometimes just comes down to really making an effort to getting to know people, and so that they don't they're less likely to put you into that box of belonging with this group or that group and so forth. So once again, it takes time, but it's actually very rewarding. But I think you can actively, you know, obviously within sort of normal social parameters, try to overcome these really what are sort of preconceptions about how people think.
Yeah, so this piece of advice should be used with caution, but because it doesn't always work. But one of the things that you can almost guarantee with computer scientists is if you're having trouble carrying on a conversation, ask them what their research is. And they can usually carry on the conversation from there on their own because they love what they do. If the walls between the cliques are not so bad, if you could find somebody in the other clique that you could do a little investigation, find out what they're doing, and offer to help them, you know, say, you know, I read this paper that you did. I was really interested by this point. Could we maybe work together to just kind of expand on your work? You can't, obviously you don't have enough bandwidth to do that over and over and over again, but most of us are pretty self-centered in that what we're doing is important to us. And we like it when other people think that our work is nice and want to help us. So again, going back to the original point, what is the other people's measure of success, and can you help them without kind of getting in the way of your own? But if the walls are too deep, and I have been in situations, very rarely in industry where there are deep walls between groups, at some point there's nothing you can do by yourself. It takes an act of God to change it, or somebody switching companies. I've always managed groups that were in different areas, languages in HCI or databases in medical informatics, is to say at first principles, your top publications are just as important as their top publications. The products that you're trying to impact are just as important as the product. You understand that there are top, middle, and low tier publications in each field. There are important products and less important products in each brand. There are big contributions and small contributions to each. If we can get past that my area is more important than yours, you have a chance at a reasoned conversation. But it's, you know, the times where first principles can be discussed and imposed doesn't cover the whole universe. When it does, she's right, it really does take the animosity out of these conversations.